you've mentioned you are an anti-imperialist.
Yeah.
What is anti-imperialism to you, and why is it important?
For me, anti-imperialism is the understanding that there is a global class division between a few handful of millionaires and billionaires in the first world countries in the United States and Europe. I would add Japan and certain parts of Australia, the wealthy global elite who run the global economy, who run the banks, industries, the means of production globally, and at the expense of the majority of workers and peasants in the global South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as well as pockets of the imperial core, pockets of Australia, pockets of North America, pockets of Europe. And imperialism is a worldwide system of exploitation of inequality based on capitalism. The Leninist understanding of the highest stage of capitalism is imperialism, monopoly capitalism, where people are no longer accumulating profits, surplus value through the exploitation of labor so much, but also through things like banking, through war, the accumulation through destruction. And I think we see that in so many different ways. Like the fact that people are making money from investing in stocks and just crunching numbers, and they're not producing any value, I think is a perfect example of imperialism, how it's able to not create anything. It's able to only create chaos and disorder and violence. But yet these are some of the highest paid people in the world. Imperialism, I think, aside from the base root being economic, right, the exploitation of labor, of capital against labor on an international scale, it's also ideological, it's spiritual, it's mediatic. From the perspective of somebody from a global South country, again, my family is from Honduras, which is the poorest country in Latin America after Haiti, right? Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, then is Honduras, or a very small and poor country, even compared to other Latin American countries. And aside from there being financial imperialism in Honduras by the US and other countries, if we're talking about palm oil plantations, United Fruit, sweatshops that are owned by Canadian, companies like Fruit of the Loom and Nike and stuff like that. There's also mediatic and spiritual, this idea that people in my country are less than people in the US. We don't have our own media. We don't have our own industries, our printing. Everything that we consume is produced in the US, is manufactured. Even though the resources are taken from the global South, they're repackaged and then resent back to us as like hand-me-downs, And so imperialism has so many different levels. For example, the fact that the US is the country that has destroyed Honduras throughout all of its history, I would say more so even than Spain. But yet so many Hondurans who I've spoken to who come to the United States, they want to forget all about Honduras. They want to assimilate into the United States because they don't even view their own people as equals. They don't even see it's colonization, right? It's a colonization of what we produce and what's ours is not good enough for the United States. And so there's so many different levels to it. I mean, that's something that we experience with other countries as well, with Bangladesh, with Haiti, the poorest of the poor. Because even within the global class division, like, for example, even comparing countries like Mexico and Honduras, like my girlfriend's from Mexico, Mexico is, of course, victim of imperialism, financial and everything. But at least in Mexico, like, they've been able to maintain their own music industry, their own cinema, their own printing press, their own, they still have a certain degree of national autonomy in that sense and things that they've maintained because of their size and population as a nation. But for our countries that are, less than 10 million people, that are the poorest of the poor, everything, all the TV that people are watching is American TV, Friends with Spanish subtitles, McDonald's, they're getting rid of our local foods and replacing it with this imported poison and garbage from the US because they want to assimilate into American culture. And so that's kind of where I go into imperialism, not just being economic, but spiritual and ideological, because it makes you think that you're less than, you have to adapt to a culture that doesn't give a fuck about you. But yet they're exploiting your lands and your people. And it's harder for the nations that are more oppressed, that are smaller, that are poor, to preserve that, because you're competing just the same way that, like, on the market, you know, in these countries, like, are people going to go to the elder woman in the community who has been serving the same food for years, or are they going to go to this uh, McDonald's or a Burger King that pops up in their neighborhood that has this, because it also comes with an identity, right? Like, if you go to, I'm sure if you go to Aboriginal areas in Australia, First Nations areas, their local food and culture is competing against Western culture as well, like these Western institutions that seem more appealing because they're packaged better and more commercial, you know. And that's a big problem too, you know. It's just like, it's so many, on so many levels. And that's why, like, right now, I'm in the process of rereading Capital by, you know, by Marx, and he talks about value. Like, this is so important, like how we determine value, what is valuable. And even like looking at a McDonald's burger, right? In a third world country, you're like, a McDonald's burger versus, like, in Honduras, our native foods are like beans, tortillas, corn. In Honduras, people will look at a McDonald's burger as more valuable than this nutritious, healthy, indigenous food, just because of the way it's packaged, the label, the commercials, or ba-da-ba-ba-ba, you know, all that stuff that's around this. It just has better, and it's all smoke and mirrors. And Marx talks about that in Capital, that, you know, the capitalists know how to veil their commodities with fake value, with fictitious capital. You know, even though you eat a burger, McDonald's burger, it's probably one of the worst things for you, you know, health wise. And so we just have to redefine our values. A part of decolonizing from imperialism is redefining values, understanding what is valuable, and a lot of it is just reclaiming what is yours. You know, so that, for me, that's kind of how I see imperialism.